Welcome everyone to part 2 of how to build a learning management system on Dittofi. Samuel is going to continue building from where we left off last week. Today's focus is on backend actions in Dittofi. We're super excited you're all here. Thank you for joining us again if you're returning, and welcome if it's your first time on our webinar. And please feel free to ask questions in the chat. James and I will help answer your questions as they come in. I will hand it over to Samuel. Thanks so much, Samuel. We're looking forward to this.
Awesome. So yeah, last week we basically went through the kind of database design for this system that we're going to build. So we set up all the tables that we need to actually store the data for the end app. So as a brief recap, we kind of highlighted the point that in fact, all applications really are going to be supported by data. For a learning management system, we need to store data on things like users that are using our system. We need to store data on things like courses that you can take in the system, things like lessons, answers, questions, that kind of thing. So we kind of worked and built up the database design to support that. What we need to do next in building this is to move on to what we call the kind of backend part of the app. So to give you a kind of, I guess, high level, what our end goal is going to be, we've kind of set up this application database over here, which has a whole bunch of tables in it, storing information like courses and users and lessons, like I said. And we need to be able to basically take the data out of that database and display it in our front end. So in our front end, this will be like the web browser that the person's looking at our system from. We need to be able to display like a list of courses, for example. And then we need a way for people to like click on a course and be able to see all the lessons that are associated with that course. So displaying data from the database is a very large part of what we're trying to do. And then the other thing we need to do is we need to be able to kind of collect up data from the front end and put that into our database. So we need, for example, the ability for a instructor to come to our platform and create a course. And when he creates that course, we want that course to be persisted and saved in the database. That same instructor might want to create a lesson. We want to take that lesson and store it in our database. We'll also need the ability for everyday users to come to our app and like sign up. So when they sign up, again, we're going to store their details in our database. So the way that's going to work is we're going to be kind of taking data from our front end and sending it to our database. And then similarly, we're going to be taking data from our database and sending it to our front end. That's the kind of very high level goal. And that goes to pretty much every app that you're building in the world. So the way you do that in our platform is using these concepts of front end and back end actions. The back end actions are basically responsible for taking data and putting them into our database or grabbing data out of the database. They can also do other things that we'll get into in a bit. And in order to basically run those back-end actions, we have to rely on what we call front-end actions. So the full workflow will be a front-end action will run, and that will kind of trigger a back-end action to run, and that back-end action will read and write data from our database. We'll get into kind of front-end actions a bit more in the next session. But today we're going to be focusing more on this back-end action part, which is going to be the part that's actually reading and writing data to the database. Won't be doing any kind of display on the front end quite yet, but it'll be kind of managing all of that back-end process. So what actually are back-end actions? A way of thinking about these is kind of like a function, if you ever did maths in the past. If not, talk through this. So what a backend action will do is it will basically take an input. It will then perform some kind of operation on that input, and then it will generate some kind of output. So a really simple example, if you had a backend action to add together two numbers, your input would be number 1 and number 2. Your function would be adding those two numbers together, and then your output would be the sum of those two numbers. So if those two numbers were the numbers 1 and 1, then our output would be 2, because our function would be adding together those two numbers. A more kind of app-specific example would be a bit of login functionality. If you want to log someone into a app, you need to take some information from that person who's going to be logging in. So they'll come to a login form. You need to take some information off them. You then need to perform some function, which checks if they've logged in correctly. And if so, you need to produce some output. So in this case, the input would be like the username and the password that the person's typing into the form. That's going to be the input to our action. Then the action itself is going to be checking the username and password, make sure that the user's entered in a valid username and password. And then the output is going to be a kind of accepted or rejected in this case. Accepted if they've entered in the correct details, or rejected if they've entered in the false ones. So everything we're going to be doing today is going to be revolving around this concept of taking some inputs, performing some function on those inputs, and then producing an output. So when we actually get to backend actions, backend actions are basically broken down into 3 main parts. First off, you have the trigger, which is the thing that's going to actually cause this backend action to run. So for example, generally speaking, you want your backend action to run when someone clicks on a button in your app. When someone clicks on like the login button, for example, you want to trigger your login backend action to run. Backend actions also have variables, which we'll talk a bit more about in a little bit. But these are essentially going to be kind of placeholders that can store bits of data that you need to use in your action. And then finally, they have events. So in the example of the login action that we looked at a moment ago, the event would be the actual process that's kind of checking your username and password. In our function example that we were talking through, we gave the example of logging in. I also gave an example of kind of adding two numbers together. These are quite simple examples. In other examples, you might have multiple things happening within that function. So you might be creating a new record in a table, then logging someone in afterwards, and then sending an email, for example. So that kind of central function bit might have multiple events inside it happening one after the other. So what I'm going to do now is kind of take that high-level concepts we just discussed there and show it in practice within the builder. And to do that, we're going to build out these main features here. So we're going to add the actual login example that we just talked through then. We'll add a sign up one. And then we're going to add what we call CRUD functionality for these different tables here. So for those of you that don't know, CRUD is an acronym that stands for create, read, update, and delete, which are the four main operations you want to perform on data in your tables. You want to create new records in a table. You want to be able to read and display data from a table. That's the R. You might want to update existing records in the table. That's the U. And you might want to delete existing records from a table. So when I was talking earlier about how we need to be able to kind of take data from our database and display it, and we also need to be able to put new data into the database, that kind of mirrors this concept of CRUD here. We're going to be looking to create new data in our database and kind of pull out data, and in some places update and delete it as well. So I'm just going to escape out of this now and just step across into our app again that we were making. So quick recap, these were the tables that we came up with here. We had a users table where we're going to be kind of storing all our new users for our app. We said users could have a particular role, so they could either be like an instructor that's posting courses, or they could be a just an end user that's coming to actually view a course. We then had a courses table where instructors could come and post their courses. We had a lessons table, so we said each course might have multiple lessons associated with it. And then we had these questions and answers tables where we said people could post up questions on their individual lessons, in fact, and then other people could come and answer those questions, so kind of quiz associated with each lesson as well. So if I step down now into this third tab here, this is the backend actions tab here. This is where we're going to come and build out those functions that we were talking about. So to begin with, we're just going to click this new action button here. I'm going to create an action here that I'm going to call sign up. This is going to be the function to kind of sign a user up to the application. We said an action consists of 3 things, and the first thing was a trigger. So here it's asking you to pick a trigger. I'm not going to get too much into these now, but if you want to trigger your action by someone clicking on a button in the front end of your app, then the correct trigger to pick is this endpoint 1 here. So we've now added our trigger. You can see the second 2 components that I mentioned, which were the variables and the events. But before we get to that, let's think back to our function diagram that we were talking about before. So we said that functions, or these actions, they're going to take inputs, they're going to do something with that input, and they're going to produce an output. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define what the input is going to be. So if we want to sign someone up to our application, what we want to do is we want to create a new record in our users table with that person's like email and password at least, and also their role as well. We could also include their first name and last name. If you remember from last week, we said these fields would not be mandatory. So it might be the case that you sign up with just an email and password and role and then add these in later on, or you might want to collect all that information up front. That's kind of up to you when you're building the app. So as a minimum, the inputs we're going to need for this are going to be the email of the user that's signing up, the password, and their role. So in our platform, the place you come to define the inputs is just down here, where you have this query variables option here. So I can come here and I can click add variable, and I can add email. I can add password, and then I can add role, like so. So now this particular function will accept these 3 inputs. So that's the kind of first part of this diagram here. We've got the inputs that we've defined. So next we've got to think about is what do we actually want to happen in this big white box here? What's our action actually going to do? So in our particular case, we want to create a record in this users table. So save some data for the user that's signing up. And to do that, we come to the second of the 3 kind of components for our action, which is the event. So if I click this add event button, you can see an event is basically one operation that's taking place within your action. So we have different events, do things like log people out of your account, events for like sending emails and so on. Under this math section, we have like, add events. We wanted to build out that function example that I was talking about earlier. And then under this database section here, we have the most commonly used events, which are the ones to actually interact with the data in your database. So the first one is this create one that we're going to use. Each event has a different set of options associated with it. So for the create event, it's going to ask us which table or which model do I want to put my data into. So I could pick like the user's model, for example. And then it's going to ask us to say what data is going to go into what particular columns. So I could pick my email column. I want to put data in there. I could pick my password column. I want to put data in there. And I could pick my role column. So I want to put data in there. So now the question is, what data do I want to go into each of these? If we think of it kind of at your end application, you want to take the data from the form and then put that data into these relevant columns. But if we think in terms of this kind of diagram that we've drawn out here first, we want to take the inputs to our action and we want to insert those into our table. So we defined 3 inputs, email, password, and role. We want to take those inputs and put them in here. So the way you can do that is just by clicking on this little plus button here. And here you can then see those inputs that we made. So I can see the email one here. I can see the password one here. And then I can see the role one here. So I've got email, password, and role. Each event might also produce some kind of output as well. So in this create event here, this is going to create a new user in one of our tables. The output of this event is going to be the entire row that was created in our users table. And that's what this as option here is specifying. This is allowing you to give a name to that output. So I could call this like new user, for example, and save it. And I could then, if I want to actually test this and see it, I can click this build code button up here, which is going to kind of generate the code for this and redeploy it. And then you can come to this green run action button here. And this lets you actually test directly from the backend this particular function that we've made here. So what you would do is you would come here and type in like your example email. So I'll put in this one here. We could put an example password, and then we could put in, I guess, like instructor, for example, is the role here. So this is an example then of, creating a basic sign up one that's going to take some data and insert it into a particular table here. Other things you might want to do in this sign up action here is once the user signed up, you might want to log them in afterwards. So we can add a separate event to do that as well. Before I do that, actually, let's just click this button here. If I click this run button here, this will actually run the action that I've made so we can test it. So this is sending like the email, the password, and the role. So if I come back here and kind of refresh my users table, we're going to see that new record that was created in here. So in other words, we took our input here, and then we performed some like function in the middle, which was to create some data. In this example that we gave here, we said that there was an input and an output. So in our case, what's the output? If I go back to this run action one again, let's add another just dummy email in here and run this again. If I scroll down a bit here, you can see the kind of response, which is the output that's generated by this action. Right now, if we look down here, the response is kind of in this box here. and you'll see this is just says null, which basically means there's no output. If we want to actually give an output to our action, the way you do that is by coming here and setting this response variable that you see here. So I told you when I did the create event here, that when we create a record in this table, we get some output to this event, and that output is the whole row that was created. And we gave a name to that here. We called it new user. So what I can do is I can come to this response variable and I can find that new user. So that's the output from this event here. And if I build this again and run it, you'll now see that the output of this is going to be the actual new user that was created. Few small things here. These different kind of options that we see here, you can see like the role, the email, and the password. So these are the input to our action. And you can see the new user here, which is the new row of data that was created by this event. So these are grouped by where they were created. So the new user is grouped under this heading event because it was created by an event. This create event here, that's what we call an event. And this role, email, and password, this is grouped under this endpoint section here. And that's because they're under this triggered by endpoint section here. That's one thing to bear in mind. But let's just run this again now with another email. Let's just scroll down again here. Now you can see our output. We have the whole row of data as our output. So that was the new user that we made. So we can see like the ID, for example, of that user. We can see their email, password, role, and we can see that currently first and last name are empty because we didn't set anything for that yet. So that's a basic example of the sign up. So I said as well, once you've signed up, you probably want to log your user in automatically. So to do that, we can extend this action a bit. We can add another event underneath. The event that we want when you're logging someone in is this login event, which is under security here. And this is going to ask you to pick what columns represent the username and the password. Before we do that, I just want to talk very, very briefly about this authentication profile that we've got up here as well. So this first option here said, please select an authentication profile, and I picked this one here. So these authentication profiles basically allow you to specify which table you're going to authenticate your user against. So in our case, we want to check the email and the password from the users table. If you were building a different system, you might be storing authentication related data in different tables. Even in this case, if we'd gone with having a table called like instructors, for example, we might have a different login mechanism for instructors. So we need to kind of tell the system which table is the one we're actually going to be logging in with. And the way you do that is you come down and use these authentication profiles. So you'll see here, I've got this basic login authentication profile. And I've specified on this that the login table, so the table I'm going to be logging in with, is going to be the users table, and that I'm going to be using the username as the email, and the password is going to be the password. So if we'd had a different column here for like username, for example, then in that case, maybe we would have username selected here as our username. But in this case, we're going to be using the email as the username. So that's why I've selected that here. So now if I come back to our event again, I've got this basic login one selected. I can now say, what data am I going to be passing in as the username and password to actually verify this user? Well, if you remember, we had our email and our password and our role that were inputs to this action. So I can take the email from here, same as I did with the create. I can take the password from here as well. So that's now taking the email and password that I input into this action. And then again, this particular event also outputs some data. It will output the newly logged in user. That's what I'm putting in here. So I can just type in like newly logged in user, for example. So now this sign up action here is going to take the inputs, email, password, and role. It's going to use those inputs to create a record in our users table. And then once it's done that, it's going to use the email and password input to actually log that new user into the platform. So that's the sign up one built there. If I come back out now and let's do another action, which I'm going to call login. It's going to be a very similar process. We're going to start off by doing add trigger. Like I said, we're going to always use endpoint when we want to trigger this from someone clicking a button in our app. So we've done the trigger bit. Next question is, what are the inputs for this particular action? If we're logging someone in, we're going to be checking their email and their password. So the inputs are just going to be the email and the password. So I can now scroll down here. I can add those inputs. So I can add email, and I can add password. That's the inputs to my action defined. And now I need to say what's going to happen in the main body of my function. What's going to happen in this section here when I pass in the username and password? Well, I'm going to take that username and password and I'm going to make sure they're valid and log the user in. And to do that, we're just going to use that same login event again. So I can do security section. I can pick login. I'll pick the same profile. And again, I'll take the email and the password, and I'll use those to log my user in. And then, as I said, this is going to output some information. The information it's going to output is the newly logged in user. So I'm going to call this output newly logged in user. So now I've defined my inputs, the email and the password, and I've defined the main kind of function that's going to take place within this by adding this login event. The last thing I might want to do is specify what the output of this action is going to be. And to do that, once again, you can come back to this trigger section here, where you've got response variable here. I can come and I can find that newly logged in user here. So I said this login web user events will output the user that's just logged in. And here you can give a name to that output. So we've just called it newly logged in user. So I'm taking that output from this event. I'm going to return that out of my action as well. So now when this one runs, it's going to log the user in and then return the data for the newly logged in user as well. So we can go to the run action button here again. And if I remember what my email was that I used, probably this one. And it was hopefully pass 1, 2, 3. I was being sensible about that. Let's see. Maybe not. Let's try that again. Different user. 6. Or in fact, let's sign up with a totally new account. So I know what the password is. Instructor, like so. Now we have our new account here. Let's just log in again with that. And there we go. Yeah, awesome. So this logs my user in. And now I can see the details for the newly logged in user down here. So that's their email that I put in, and then the rest of the information about them. So now if I go back out of here, that's the kind of sign up and log in. We now want to look at those things that we were calling like CRUD. So they create, read, update, delete for these different tables here. That sign up action that we made is an example of a create. So let's go ahead and create a similar one like that, but for courses in this case. So if I come back down here again, and let's do a new action, I'll call this one like create course. This is what our instructor's going to do when they log into the app. They're going to create a course. So again, the trigger is going to be endpoint because we want the user to run this by clicking a button in the front end of the app. So then the next question is, what's the input for this going to be? We kept this simple for now. We said that course just needs to have a name, and then it needs to have an ID for the person that created it. So the input would be the name, and then it would be the user that actually created it. So I'm going to come here, I'm going to scroll down again, I'm going to add name and save. So this point, I want to pause for a moment and highlight one other important thing, which is that right now, this particular action that we're working on here, we want to say this action can only actually be run by people who have signed up. So people who actually exist in our users table. And we want to make sure those people have actually logged in. So we want someone to log into the app and then create a course afterwards. In other words, if you're not logged in, we shouldn't let you actually run this action at all. And in order to do that, you can set this other option here on our trigger. So we set our trigger to endpoint here. We kind of already looked at what the response variable does, but just above that, there's this section here called authentication profile. And here, if you set this to the authentication profile that you created, then this means no one can actually run this action unless they've logged into your app. If they try and run it when they haven't logged in, it's going to throw an error message. So for actions that you want to be hidden behind a login screen, it's important to set this login, this authentication profile here. Now, we've only added name as like an input variable. We haven't added the user ID. I'm going to show you why that is in a second as well. But first off, let's just go and add an event. So in our example here, we've specified the input, which is going to be the name of the course we're creating. And now we need to think of the actual function we want to perform. So the function we want to perform is going to be the create one again, to create a record in a table. So let's pick the table that we want to create the record in. That's going to be the courses table. And now let's pick the fields that we want to put data into. So we're going to start with the name one here. What data do we want to go into this name one here? We want to take the input to our action and we want to use that here. So as with the last example, I can click this little plus button here. I can find my name, which was the input to this particular action. Then secondly, I want to add the user ID as well. So we didn't actually include the user ID explicitly as an input to this action. So if I come here and look under this drop down here, we haven't got user ID. But what we did do is we said that you have to be logged in to actually run this action. And if you have to be logged in to run this action, if we've set that authentication profile, then you're going to see a new input which is always added, which is going to be the current user. So that's going to represent the current user that's logged in when they run this action. So what we can do is we can use the current user, and we can use their ID, and we can use that and save that in our table. So we're taking the name from the inputs that we specified to this action, and then for the user ID, we're taking the ID of the user that actually is running this action. And we know who that user is because we've said in order to run this action, you have to be logged in. So as with the other create events, we said events can produce some outputs. The output for the create event is going to be the new row in the database. So we'll just call this one new course and save it like so. That will allow us now to actually create a course. Let's just build this one again as well, and I can kind of show you the behavior. Whilst that's going there as well, we want to do the same process basically for lessons, comments, questions, and answers. So most of this is quite repetitive now. So let's just go ahead and add a create lesson one of one more example, and let's go back and kind of test all of our different actions that we've created to show how they all fit together. So if I do another new action here, I'm going to call this one create lesson. Again, trigger is going to be endpoint. We're going to be creating this from some form in our front end. If we look in our lessons table, we can see we've got a name and we've got a course ID. So that's the data we want to actually save in this table. So first question again is, what is the input for this action going to be? So we know by looking at this table, the input we want is the name and the lesson ID. So I can just come down here and again add name, and I can add lesson ID. So that's the input defined for my action. Then what do I want to actually happen inside my action? I want to create a record in one of my tables. So again, same example. I'm going to come here, do event type, select create. This is then going to ask me what table do you want to create the data in. I'll pick my lessons table here. Then it's going to ask me what data is going into what columns. So I'll pick my course ID, I'll pick my name, and I want to say, take the inputs to my action and put them into the columns. So to do that, again, click on the little plus button and then say, in fact, I named this wrong. Let's just go back. This should be, sorry, course ID, not lesson ID. Let's do course ID there. And then let's do create lessons, course ID and name. And then let's take the input from the action. So now we can take the course ID, then let's take the name. And then this event is going to produce an output again. And the output is going to be the new row of data for this lesson. So we can call this like new lesson and save. Finally, let's just do the same for the questions and the, questions and the answers. So once again, we'll do a new action here. We can call this one create question. Again, trigger endpoint. So we're going to be running this from our front end. The question is going to take the actual question, and then it's going to take the ID of the lesson that this question belongs to. So our inputs are going to be question, and then lesson ID. Let's save. And then what do we want to do kind of inside this function? We want to, again, create some data. So I'm going to come here and do the create event again. And I'll pick the questions table and I'll say lesson ID and question are the columns I want to put data into. What data is going to go in there? Again, it's going to be the input to our action. So it's going to be that lesson ID and the question that we specified as the input to this action. And then again, this is going to output some data, which will be the full row of data for that new question. So we'll just call this one new question, like so. Let's just pause here and just build this one more time and test some of these to see the examples. And then we've got enough time to do a couple of slightly different ones as well. So let's click into create course first. So on our course, we said our input's going to be the name of the course. So let's type in, let's just say web development, for example, click run. And again, we come back here now and check the courses table. You can see we've got name web development, and then you can see we've got user ID 6. So user ID 6 is this one here. And the reason we've got user ID 6 is because in our create event, we said take the ID of the current user. And if you remember, this was the last user that I logged in with. So this is the currently logged in user. If I was to switch to a different user, let's try logging in as this one here. So I'm now logged in Samuel Virgo 7. Let's create a course for them as well, which will be development part 2, let's say. Can run that. Now let's check in here again. And now we've got web development part 2, and that's for user ID 5. So that's the Samuel Virgo 7 user there. If I was to come and create a lesson, it's going to be the same thing here. We can just come and enter in like the course ID, we want to use the name, and then click the run button again here. So that's kind of how you set up the backend for like the sign up, login, and the create actions. So let's just do a example of how you can actually grab data out of your database and return that rather than just creating data. We said at the start we want to insert data into the database, but we also want to be able to pull data out and display it on our screen. So let's begin. Let's say we're a user, we've come to this platform, and we want to see a list of courses. So I'll create a new action here. I'm going to call this one like get courses. It's going to get me a list of courses. Again, this is going to get run from the front end. So the trigger here will be endpoint again. In this particular case, if we think about this action, what it's going to be doing, it's going to be going to our database, grabbing a list of courses and just returning them. So actually, you don't really need to specify any inputs for this particular action, unless you wanted to say, get me a specific course, for example, in which case you have to give the name of the specific course you want to get. But if we just want to get a full list of all courses, we don't really need any input. So that answers kind of question 1. But what we want to do is we want to actually go and grab those courses and return them. And to do that, you don't need an event either for this one here. What you need is the third and kind of final part of the action that we didn't talk about yet, which is this variables section here. So a variable is basically a placeholder to store some data in. So to give you an example, you could have a variable here called like test. And this could just store the value like hello world, for example. So that would just be a plain text variable storing just a text string. If you look at the different kinds of variables, you could also use like a number variable to store like the number 1, 2, 3. or you could use a like decimal if you want to store a decimal, and so on. Those are all quite self-explanatory. But you also have some platform-specific variable kinds. And the one that we'll look at now is this collection variable kind here. So this collection is kind of specific to the Dittofi platform. And what this is a variable that rather than storing a piece of text or a number, this is storing a list of records from one of your tables. So this is going to ask you what table will be getting that list of records from. So I can pick the courses table here, call this variable courses. When this variable is created, it's going to store a list of all your courses. So I've now created that variable up here. So we now have we said we don't need any inputs. We don't need any events. All we've done so far is created this courses. But our action will have an output, and that output is going to be the list of courses. That's what we want to get. So like we saw in the other examples, if I come over here on the right, where I've got like response variable here, I can set that to courses. And now this is going to be the output of this particular action. This action is going to output a list of courses. So we now have a way to basically create a course, create a lesson, and so on. And we see there's a way to actually go and get a list of courses as well. Very quickly, we'll just add one more, then we can take questions and things. So let's also add a get lessons one, just to show you a slightly different example. So this one's going to be get lessons. In our case, we want to get a list of lessons from our table here, but we want to, let's say, get a list of lessons that belong to a particular course. Maybe we can call this actually get course lessons. So let's say we want to get all the lessons that belong to this like web development course here. So like course ID 2, for example. The trigger for this is going to be endpoint again, because we're running this from our front end. And this time we are going to have an input. The input will be the lessons that are associated with the course that we're getting. So we want to get all the lessons associated with course ID 2. So the input, we want to be able to put in a number like number 2 or number 3 and get all the lessons that are associated with that ID. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to create an input, which will be a number this time. And I'm going to call this course ID. Now, again, I can add a variable. That variable can be collection one. Like I said, a collection is a variable that stores a list of records from one of your tables. And I can call this one then lessons. It says what tables I want to use. I want to use the lessons table. So this will now get me a full list of all lessons from my lessons table. But I want to go a bit further. I want to say only get me the lessons that belong to a particular course. And that's where these other kind of options down here start to come in. So this where option here, this allows you to apply a filter so that this variable won't contain all the lessons. It will only contain certain lessons that meet the filter criteria. And the filter that I want is I want to say where course ID equals, and then I want to take the input to my action. So the input to my action was this course ID. I want to take that and say, get me all the lessons where the course ID is equal to that course ID that I'm sending to my action. So that's going to create the variable, but this time with a filter applied to it. So we've got our input defined. We've defined kind of what's going on inside our function. The last thing is what do we want to output? And the output is going to be this list of lessons. So to specify the output, we can come to this response variable here and pick that lessons. build that again. And again, you'll see actually that the lessons here are grouped now under this action section here. So I pointed out before that these different variables that you see here are grouped according to where they're created. This lessons one was created up here for this whole action, which is why it's under this action heading here, as opposed to under an event heading if it was like the output of an event. So to kind of compare those two things, let's go to get courses first. And let's just click this run button here. If we scroll down, you can see I've got a list of courses getting returned. Then let's just go to our create lesson one here. Let's add, let's create a lesson for course ID 2. It's called lesson 1 for now. Just click run. So that creates our new lesson. If I click in here, I can see it. Let's do the same again. We'll just call this one lesson 2. And then let's do one for course ID 3. So if I do course ID 3, and let's add lesson, let's call this one lesson for course 3, just so we can see the difference. So now if I look at all my lessons, I've got lesson 1, lesson 2 belonging to course ID 2. I've got lesson for course 3 belonging to course ID 3. So if I now finally come to this get course lessons one, this one is asking me to input a course ID, and then it should give me a list of lessons that are associated with that course ID. So if I was to take course ID 2, for example, first, I can see these 2 lessons here. If I was to switch that to course ID 3, we now get this one lesson back here. So that's an example then of how to actually get data out of our tables. So if we just quickly go back to our slides again and bring up from here. We said we're going to start adding CRUD functionality for these different items here. I said CRUD stands for like create, read, update, and delete, which are the main operations we're going to be performing. So what we looked at today mainly were the create, kind of create new records, and then read at the very end to actually pull data out of the tables as well. So we'll also look next time at how we can kind of update existing data if someone wants to say update a course they've already created, or how to delete some information if someone wants to say delete a particular lesson from a course, for example. And that will kind of build up the basics for like the back end of the app, which will then need to kind of connect to our front end at some point, which we'll get into as well. But I think for now, I don't know if we want to have any questions, other things you want to discuss now as well that are outstanding.
Thanks so much. We do have a question here. So Rob is asking, still curious about the instructor privacy rules. So when you were making the course, he was wondering, would you validate that the person who's creating the course is an instructor? And how would you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was going to kind of leave that for next time. We could go into that now as well. So when I go to actually create the course, we've authenticated this particular endpoint to say you have to be logged in to run it. And we know who the current user is as well, which we've used here. But how do we actually check that this user is an instructor? So they actually got permission to make this course. So the way you can do that is I can add another event above here to do that validation. And the particular event that I'm going to use is this return event, which is under this flow control section here. And the way this event works is it allows you to specify a condition. And if that condition is met, it will terminate the action. So it will prevent you getting to this create point here. So in our case, the condition would say if current user role not equal to. Now we want to say not equal to instructor. So I can add a variable here that I'm just going to call instructor. Would normally specify this as a variable. And I can say current user.role is not equal to instructor. This is then going to terminate that particular action. And you can specify some data that you want to kind of return instead of the new record. So you could have, for example, like an error message here, which could be something like must be an instructor. And you can use that in here. So I could pick the error message actually for both of these here. We didn't really get into the status codes, what those are today. But for anyone, we can kind of talk about that more next time. Or for anyone more technical, the status code will be the kind of response code to the endpoint that you're running. So in this case, I'm going to add a number here, which I could call like forbidden or something. And this could be like a 403. This is essentially a code that's going to tell us whether the endpoint ran successfully or not. So that's how you would do that.
Awesome. Yeah, so just to clarify, running the condition, if the condition is met, it does not go on to the next one. Whereas if you, is that?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, if the condition is met, it should be equals, right? Yep. If the role is instructor, then it doesn't go on. Sorry, my mistake.
Then it, oh, now I'm confused. So if it is instructor, then it does go on to the next one. If it isn't instructor, then
no, yeah. Sorry, I was right the first time. Yeah, if this,
okay.
If an instructor, yeah, you can do that. If it isn't right, then it will get returned now. So if this condition is met, then it will exit.
Then it will exit. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Perfect. Any other questions? Oh, so Rob also wanted to let you know he loved the slides and the high level overview. It's really helpful. And then would have to be above since it's checking that first, correct? Yes, it's running in order.
Actually, that doesn't actually matter in this particular case.
No.
So this will kind of kill the whole action and reverse anything that's inside of it. So you could put it after as well. If you've got like database actions happening, but for readability, I would put it first. Yep.
Oh, I see. So if you put that at the end, it would get to it and then it would just not do anything else that was in.
It would undo the create one. Yeah.
Undo exactly. The create. Oh, that's good. That's helpful because you can't move them around, right? At this point, you can't move them around after you create them.
No, you can kind of insert them into different places. Yep.
Right. Okay. Awesome. So, let's see. We have a link in here. So the pre-check what the status codes are from Ogusan, and then Baraka says the new UI looks great. Good job, Dittofi. Jordan Richardson. It would seem like external API calls would be similarly set up through actions. Could you confirm? Thanks.
Yep, 100%. It's almost identical to what we've done here. You can basically set up something similar to this like endpoint configuration that you see here, but for like an external one, and then you can run it inside one of these actions, 100% as a different event, basically.
Awesome. I think that's it for our questions. Thank you everyone for being here. We are going to be back next week at the same time for our third session. And in the meantime, if you have questions, you can direct them to team@ProNoCoders, and we'll help get everything straightened out. Thank you, Samuel. Thank you, James. It was good to see you both today.
It does.
Hey.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.